Good evening, and welcome to Skeptical Inquirer Presents. The perceptive among you may have already noticed that I'm not Leon Lord, who's the usual host for this program. Leon is off tonight. I am Ronald Lindsay. Some of you may recognize me as the former president and CEO of the Center for Inquiry. The Center for Inquiry, of course, is the sponsor for this program. I'm not going to try to match Leon in terms of her wit and humor. She is a professional comedian after all. But I do think the substance of the program tonight will match what you come to expect from Skeptical Inquirer Presents. And one reason for that is we're very fortunate tonight to have as our guest Dr. Robert Sapolsky. Dr. Sapolsky is a professor of biology, neurology, neurological sciences, and neurosurgery at Stanford University. He's the author of a number of nonfiction books, including the bestseller, Behave. He's the past recipient of a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant. And he's the author of the book that will be the subject of our discussion tonight, namely Determined, the Science of Life Without Free Will. By the way, if you buy the book, you're not going to get all the Post-its and flags that I have in my copy. Those I put in there to note some of the passages I thought were important. I actually ran out of flags because this book is very rich in terms of its detail and its arguments. That said, I have to be very careful about saying too much to praise the book because, as we'll find out, Dr. Sapolsky doesn't believe people deserve praise or blame. So I don't want to compliment it too much and get off on the wrong foot before we even start our conversation. But as indicated by the title of the book, Dr. Sapolsky contends that scientific evidence from biology, psychology, biochemistry, sociology, essentially all the sciences, show that in a very meaningful sense, we're not in control of our actions, that we are causally determined to do what we do, to intend what we intend, and for that reason, do not have moral responsibility for our actions. But rather than having me summarize what Dr. Sapolsky maintains, I probably should turn it over to him at this stage. And so he can talk about what his thesis and evidence is. So Dr. Sapolsky, welcome to Skeptical Inquirer Presents.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's very nice to be with a group of people who are so like-minded with my biases and quirks. We will hopefully get the dog quiet, so apologies for that. So starting off as I don't believe there's any such thing as free will, none whatsoever. I think when you put the pieces together, all we are is the sum of the biology over which we had no control and its interactions with environment over which we had no control. And the net result there is there's no room for free will. And in contrast to lots of people who ponder this, I think this is fabulous news. And I think the world will be a much better place if people jettison the notion that there's free will. Okay, so where do I think the free will concept runs into trouble? You get somebody, they do an action, they form an intent, they're conscious of the intent, they know there's alternatives available, they know what the consequences are likely to be, and they do the behavior. They press the button, they pull the trigger, they choose the ice cream flavor. And we ask the question, why did they do that? And when you look at the biology of our behavior, the answer is multi-layered. You did that because a half second ago, this part of the brain activated, that part was inhibited, whatever, because a minute ago, this stimulus in the environment pushed those neurons in that direction, stimuli that you may not even have been consciously aware of, because your hormone levels this morning had something to do with how sensitive your brain is to those stimuli, because over the previous months to years, experience, trauma, stimulation, etc., would have changed the structure of your brain and how it works. And then we're back to adolescence and childhood and remarkably fetal life, where fetal environment supplied by mom interacting with your fetal biology plays a huge role in your construction project, your brain at that point. And then back to genes. And then remarkably to some people, even further back as to like what your ancestors were up to 3, 4 centuries ago when they invented your culture, because that had something important to do with how your mother was mothering you within minutes of birth, how that particular environment was shaping your brain construction. And the whole point is not, ooh, there's all these different disciplinary approaches and you put them together and collectively they're not different disciplinary approaches. If, for example, you're talking about the genetics of behavior, by definition, you're talking about the millions of years of evolution during which the genes evolved. And by definition, you are talking about your fetal life when environment there was programming those genes. And by definition, you're talking about which genes were active this morning while you were having breakfast, making this or that protein in this or that part of the brain. And when you look at the extent to which all those different facets of biology interacting with environment over which we had no control, it forms one seamless arc. And at this point, we know enough about that that it is appropriate to turn to someone who insists there's free will and say, show me how this works. Show me how a brain produces a behavior
Okay.
independent of all that, independent of its history.
Right. Very good. Very good summary. I think compelling in its way. I do want to raise one thing I liked about your book is how you address some of the counter arguments that have been raised to try to say that there is free will. And there are several different ones, but the one I want you to talk about, if possible, is the one that's based on quantum indeterminacy. And I bring that up because when I was reading philosophy in the 70s and 80s, actually, it was something that some philosophers brought up as an argument to say there's free will. I think fewer philosophers buy that now, but you still find it, occasionally on the internet or what have you. And we have a very scientifically literate audience here, but I'll just give like a 30-second, very simplistic view of quantum indeterminacy, which is that at the subatomic level to describe the behavior of particles, you need a wave function, and that wave function essentially gives you a set of probabilities. So it's in tension with what we would call classic determinism, which is, if you have event X, that's always followed invariably by event Y, and that produces event Z. Whereas at the subatomic level, it appears that, well, no, you can't say that. You have event X, and instead you have a set of probabilities, Y sub 1, Y sub 2, Y sub 3, what have you. And some people have said, well, that's, an objective uncertainty, if you will, that there's all these probabilities, and therefore that shows that we can't have this determinism that you say we have. As I said, I like how you address that in the book, but I wonder if you could comment on that now for our audience, because I think some people might be familiar with that argument.
Good. Okay. I should right off the bat show that I have like this thick of expertise and understanding, the first thing about quantum mechanics, but a lot of people have leapt on it over the years. I think I'm fair in saying a lot of whom are snake oil salesmen, insisting that quantum indeterminacy is the most fundamental subatomic indeterminacy there is, at least according to like 80% of physicists who go for it. There's still some holdouts. But in any case, they see that as the source of free will. And they hit a wall for at least 3 different ways. The first one is the scale of quantum indeterministic events is so minuscule, so many dozens of orders of magnitude away from being able to influence the action of one molecule, let alone one neuron, one brain, and so on. And the notion that that effect of indeterminism is going to bubble all those orders of magnitude upward and just happen to synchronize in the same direction with all the other gazillion subatomic particles that are granted this power to bubble up that far is beyond the possibility. Second thing is that even if it did bubble up that far, what we're describing is the basis of random behavior, not the basis of what we view as people's like consistent moral compass or something. Like this is the mechanism by which you'd be spending your whole life saying, I have no idea why I just said that or did that, except your tongue muscles would be too garbled by randomness to even say that. Third reason is sort of in this Hail Mary move, some of the people who are holding out for quantum indeterminacy being free will come up with this emergent nonsense scenario of where somehow the macro level, your brain can reach down and harness, and that's the word that's often used by them, harness the quantum indeterminacy to shape it for your own, pleasure and enjoyment and free decision making. And, when you look at those arguments closely, I think it's kind of okay to say that they don't really fit with anything we know about how the brain works. So, between those three pieces, oh, it's wonderfully appealing, but that's not where you're getting free will from.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think you really did a good job in your book in essentially knocking down those arguments. I didn't really find them persuasive myself to begin with, but as I said, you still see that argument from time to time, and I think you've taken care of that very well. Now, so far, so good. Your argument is, I think, very forceful, very clear, by the way. I compliment you on that. By the way, for those who do buy the book, I recommend you read the notes that Dr. Sapolsky has, the footnotes. They're very informative and at times humorous too. I really enjoyed reading your book. But I got the
Thanks.
sense when I was reading your book that you may be deploying this very forceful argument against the wrong target. And I say that because even at the beginning of the book, when you say, you don't really got to concentrate on what's called the libertarian uh, viewpoint of free will, and that is there's somehow some kind of uncaused self or soul out there that mysteriously is not subject to causation itself, but then does cause, our brain to act in a certain way, and that translates into action. That really is, for the most part, what you're arguing against. The reason I say that is because throughout your book, when you talk about, you lay out this very clearly, the different chains of causation, the neurons that interact, the hormones that interact with neurons, where those hormones come from in terms of what we're subject to and environmental influences. You all say, after you lay out this chain of causation, well, there's no crack in there in which to insert free will. That essentially is implicitly saying to have free will, you have to have an uncaused something, a self or shadow self or something that then can affect, what we do. But of course, that's not how at least philosophers today understand free will. As you know, most philosophers, if they believe in free will take a compatibilist position. And their view is not that you need the absence of cause to have free will. And they'll accept, of course, that our character is, framed by things outside of our control. But to have free will for them just says that, well, the decisions that you make reflect who you are as a person. And you do have control over the decisions you make. And we draw a distinction, for example, as you do in your book. You indicate there are some people who don't have the mental capability for whatever reason to make decisions. They have schizophrenia, or they have some other type of mental illness, or maybe they're under some sort of other compulsion, addiction, or what have you. So we make those distinctions, but we make those distinctions because we recognize for most people, they have a range of mental abilities that allow them to weigh pros and cons and to make decisions. And really all we mean by free will is that you have that ability to make decisions that reflect who you are as a person and your character. And isn't that enough on which to hang moral responsibility?
Yeah, not for a second. And you stated it in like the most perfect way that, it's a function of your character and your values and such. How did you become the sort of person you are to have that character, to have that sort of makeup, to have those values? You had no control over like whether you were raised among hunter-gatherers or, pastoralists with a cult of honor sort of thing. You had no control over your fetal environment. You had no control over your genes, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what we see here is, you know, getting to the compatibilists. And yeah, the vast majority of people arguing for free will are compatibilists, which is to say they believe there's stuff like atoms and cells and like there's a material universe, yet somehow that's compatible with there being free will. What you see is they fall right at this juncture for this like incredibly seductive, intuitive sense in that right in the moment, yeah, You make a decision, you choose the ice cream flavor, you shoot the person, you do whatever, and you're full of intent and you know there's alternatives and all of that. And for most people and for the legal system, that's both necessary and sufficient to decide that there was free will, agency, and responsibility. And from my perspective, that misses 99% of what's going on because it is not addressing how did you become the sort of person who would have that intent at that moment. And that's what happened a second ago and a decade ago, and when you were a fetus and the culture back there, and why we evolved the way we, and all of that stuff. That's where it comes in. Just saying, did the person act with intent? And did they know that there were alternatives available to them? Is like trying to review a book where all you've done is read the final sentence of it. It misses everything that came before because, yeah, of course, our decisions are a function of our character and our values and our hard won this and our how did you become that sort of person? And when you look at the building blocks of how you became, it's stuff you had no control over.
Right. I think the difference, though, is this, that it really does come down to on what will we base moral responsibility? Because I don't think anyone can argue with how you've portrayed the science. I mean, no one thinks that we can create our own character, right? We can't, somehow magically bring ourselves into being and decide what our character is going to be. Obviously, it's been shaped, as you point out, it's been shaped from the culture, been shaped from the parents we had, been shaped when our parents chose to copulate, been shaped by how our parents brought us up, all these different things. At a certain point in time, though, we do become adults and we do recognize the distinction between adults who have a certain range of ability to control their actions and those who don't, those who have mental illness or into compulsion of some sort or what have you. And our moral system is based on being able to having a legitimate expectation that people are going to behave in a certain way, and they don't behave in that certain way, that we somehow have moral sanctions or maybe legal sanctions against them. Uh, and what you're asking for, obviously, you're setting a standard that some people would say, well, it's clearly impossible to meet. I mean, if to have free will means you have to be the author of your character completely, that no other influences except you yourself created your character, well, then obviously we don't have free will. But the question is that the standard should we have for free will? Or is it sufficient to have a moral system where we say, look, for most people, there's a range of control they have over their actions. They are susceptible to reasons in some way or another. Again, varying between people, but again, there's a wide range of behavior where we think, hey, most people fit in there. Isn't that sufficient? Why isn't that sufficient for making moral judgments?
Well, I think one of the key things right there is your use of the word varying, people of varying degrees of that. How did it come about that they varied? How did it come about that this person is more prone towards rule following than the next person, that sort of thing? How did that happen to occur? What I think we see is, the temptation. I'm not trying to sound snotty and pejorative here, but we see basically the liberal stance on these issues, which is, yeah, we have free will. Some of the time we have less than we usually do if we're tired, if we're stressed, if we're in pain, whatever. And there's some folks who have way less than average, and maybe we even know the reason why, and it's something mitigating, but that's within a backdrop of nonetheless, we basically have free will. But it still keeps coming down to, at every one of those instances, when you are expressing your values, you're expressing your proclivities, where'd they come from? Okay, so like you're taking Psych 101 in some university and you sign up for a psych experiment and you go in there and the rule is like whenever this light blinks on as fast as you can, push that button or something. And you push the button and we could say, whoa, why did you push the button just now? And looking at the alternatives, how is it that you turned out the sort of person who was brought up in a culture where you had running water and you didn't die of a tropical disease? Okay, so that is about how did you wind up where you learned to read? How did you wind up being somebody lucky enough to go to university? Where do you turn out to be the sort of person who'd be interested in psychology? How do you get the sort of temperament, that sort of combination of altruism and curiosity that you would sign up to do an experiment? How do you get the frontal cortical regulation to actually remember to write it down and show up that day? How do you wind up not being somebody where you show up there and your makeup is one where, I don't know, you're still pissed off at your parents or something, and you're thinking, oh, I know what these psychologists are up to, and I'm just going to do the opposite, and you intentionally screw up your responses to be oppositional? How do you wind up being that person or someone who's not? How do you wind up not being someone who walked into the lab and saw that all of them were busy over there with the previous subject, and you quick grab the grad student's laptop and run out of there? And at every one of these junctures, how did you become that sort of person? Because of stuff we had no control over.
No question. Again, I don't think anyone can, argue with the science that you've laid out. I mean, there are some people who would. I mean, people who believe like an immaterial soul or what have you. But leaving that group aside, uh, but again, I think it comes down to what you think the necessary conditions are for moral responsibility. If you think to have moral responsibility means you have to have ultimate control over who you are as a person, that somehow magically you could have formed your own character, then clearly you don't have free will. That's indisputable. But again, morality is a social construct, right? I mean, I guess, again, unless you think it comes down from the heavens or whatever. It's something that's formed over time, and it's formed over time because it works, right? There's a kind of a common morality that most cultures have. Obviously, there are vast differences and various rules, but most of it comes down to what we need to keep the peace, to engage trust, engage cooperation, foster cooperation, so we can have maybe a better society and ameliorate our conditions. And to do that, we have to hold people responsible for their actions, because unless we can somehow have confidence in people that they're going to fulfill their commitments, fulfill their promises, we won't be able to function in society. And to have that responsibility means that we have to treat people as being in control, proximate control of their actions. Yeah, ultimately, we're all in the same boat. I mean, none of us formed our character. But because of that, because we're in the same boat, we're in that sense somewhat equal. Again, varying degrees of control for people, varying past circumstances, granted, but there's a wide range of people who kind of fit within the norm. And for those people, we can say, yeah, they're responsible for their actions.
Well, again, it's looking at a range of variability and ignoring how it is that that variability arose. Let me give you one example. It's like a domain where intuitively we think we're seeing free will, just at its most important, is willpower. Can you do gratification postponement? Can you control your impulses, your emotions, all of that? Incredibly predictive of how successful your life is going to be as a social primate. And it has much to do with this part of the brain, the frontal cortex. And it's the brain region that makes you do the harder thing when it's the right thing to do. So, one factoid: by age 5, the socioeconomic status of the family into which you were born is already a predictor of how thick your frontal cortex is, its metabolic rate, and how good it is at doing the hold off, don't do something impulsive, it'll pay off in the long run. By age 5, where if you've made like this egregious error and picked the wrong family to be born into, and that's in the most fundamental realm. People who never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. People who have gumption and stick to it. And by age 5, and since then, since that initial finding, it's already clear by late third trimester, the socioeconomic status of a woman is already a predictor of the extent of brain volume in the fetus. Whoa, that's coming in right there. And the most fundamental realm in which we're thinking about responsibility is, at some juncture, did you feel tempted to do something and did you do it or not? And moving from the world of obviously that's one where it's justifiable in the context of like agency. Instead, we've moved into a world where it comes down to like how many synapses you have in this part of the brain and how many receptors of this and what epigenetic thing happened to you when you were 10 because of this trauma that made sure this pathway is never going to work very well, etc., etc. It's all it is what came before. And when we look at the present and how seductive it is to decide we're seeing agency, for one thing, we could look historically at all the domains in which we thought we were seeing agency in the past, and then we figured out it didn't work that way. Ooh, a seizure is not because you're demonically possessed. We figured that one out 4 centuries ago. Ooh, schizophrenia is not caused by mothers who unconsciously hate their child. Ooh, kids who don't learn how to read and keep reversing their letters aren't lazy and unmotivated. Oh, we figured out there's this thing called dyslexia, and we now know the sort of
Sure. Yeah.
microarchitecture of it. But sort of what you raise is like, how are we supposed to function if the conclusion is there's no responsibility and like you can't blame or punish, and
Yeah.
by the way, you can't praise or reward, and that's inconceivable, but we do it all the time. We do it all the time,
Yeah.
and we so
Yeah.
effortlessly have subtracted responsibility out of those circumstances that we
Right.
don't even notice that we've done it.
But let me stop you right there, because yeah, in your book, and you do a great job giving like the history of how we treated epileptics and schizophrenics, what have you, and you indicate, well, we've obviously come to understand this, and now we excuse their behavior because we understand they didn't have control, and you go on from there to say, well, we've done this before. I think that's the phrase you use. We've done this before, so we can come to understand how people don't have free will and can excuse them from responsibility. But in doing that, aren't you erasing the very distinctions we've made? I mean, we've made those distinctions between people who have schizophrenia or other mental illnesses or have some other compulsion and other people because we recognize they're different. They don't have the same level of control as, I'll say, normal people, the range of control that most people have. And if we suddenly say, well, no, that's how we treat them is now how we should treat other people, you're essentially saying, aren't you saying, well, we're all sick? I mean, you're saying they're really no different than us. Maybe
Yeah,
just a different degree, but at the end of the day,
right.
none of us have control.
Oh my God, it's so distorting to say we're all sick. No, we're not all sick. We're all biological machines and nothing
Okay.
more or less. And when we look at somebody with schizophrenia, or I've done a lot of work by now with public defenders and murder trials where the defendant has a history of a concussive head trauma, that sort of thing. And every now and then you can get a jury to actually function reasonably and say, ooh, here's a person whose entire frontal cortex was destroyed in a car accident when they were 10, and they've been completely out of control since then, and now they're up charged with their ninth murder. And I don't know, about 25% of the time, the jury will sit there and say, we can see a massive, unsubtle cable of causality linking that car accident head injury to why this person can't be held responsible for their behavior. Great. That's the liberal world of edge cases. That's where we got to watch out for the people who are a special circumstance. What is in fact going on is that with all of us, instead, what it is a gazillion microscopically thin little spider webs of influence from all those points back when,
Mhm.
and it's hard to recognize them because we don't know the science for some, and it's subtle and it's complicated and they're interactive, all of that. But the single most difficult thing to sort of grasp from that is you put all those spider webs together, and it is exactly as thick of a cable of explanation as going from that guy's car accident. That's just an easier case. It's easy to see that
Right.
distributed causality into a gazillion spider webs is a whole lot harder, and thus it's tempting to instead decide that you are free of all those spider webs that came before.
All right. Let's turn now, because I do want to turn to the consequences of what you see if in fact we're persuaded that we don't have free will, as you say. And I think it's important because I think you make clear in your book, you didn't write this book simply to make a theoretical argument about the existence of free will. You see it as necessary to make certain reforms in society, especially with respect to criminal justice, but not just criminal justice. In other areas of life, as you say, people don't really deserve the praise they think they should have if like they've earned a college degree or what have you, because really it's just the circumstances of life that enable them to do that. I do want to say though that in a couple areas, I don't think you appreciate how far-reaching uh, the consequences of your argument are, and there may be some slight inconsistencies in how you treat things. But because, at a certain point, I forget exactly when in the book you say, well, if we come around to where you're thinking, we'd be more humane and forgiving. But at other points in your book, when you talk about the attitudes that people have, we really shouldn't hate someone if they've done something wrong or whatever, because that's like hating a storm or a tornado. Well, by the same token, we couldn't be forgiving either if we had your point of view, right? Because we don't, when, hurricane comes by and destroys your house, you don't go outside and say, Hurricane Andrew, I forgive you for what you've done, right? And by the same token, I assume if we're just like storms that are blown about by these forces outside of control, why should we forgive anyone? Isn't that an irrational attitude?
Completely. And if the word forgiveness crept in there, it means I screwed up on the editing because I completely agree.
Yeah, yeah,
Forgiveness is an irrelevant concept. Forgiveness along with blame, along with praise. Yeah, that's ridiculous. No, we shouldn't become more forgiving. We should come to recognize that each of us is just the outcome of what came before, and we're all biological machines. Oh my God, that's so fatalistic. That's anything but fatalistic, because what we've learned about us as biological machines is where the buttons are, where the levers are, how you go about changing, how you go about being changed, and things of that sort. Yeah, anything but. So if forgiveness crept in there, forgive me.
no, that's right. That's right. And the other thing is, I mean, again, as you say, we really shouldn't talk about people deserving either blame or praise. And obviously, it goes beyond the criminal justice system. And presumably, it affects all areas of life. So the idea of like awards for books or movies really doesn't make any sense. Even applause after performance. I mean, people would just say, well, that's just the reaction people had. Maybe, in fact, just the temperature or the odor in the room was nice and that caused them to applaud. Uh, Medals for bravery, right? I mean, the person who jumps and, takes out a machine gun nest, maybe they're influenced by watching too many G.I. Joe movies or something, whereas the person who stayed in the trench, they happen to watch All Quiet on the Western Front before they went into combat. So all those things are gone, right? And even participation trophies, which they kind of give now for kids, right? Because it takes some effort to participate. So not everyone can participate in sports, right? So that
Yep.
that goes away. More fundamentally, and one thing that kind of troubled me is, can someone say that we can justify democracy? Because the democracy's idea that the consent of the governed is necessary for the government to have any legitimate authority. But if that consent is really no more meaningful than the blowing of the wind or a storm and things are outside the control when you go into the voting booth, how much legitimacy is there to voting? I mean, is there really some kind of moral argument you can make for democracy if, in fact, how we make our decisions is completely outside of our control?
Just to address that with one single study that shows
Okay.
exactly the flavor of this, you take a 5-year-old kid and you put them in a room with all sorts of new toys, and their mother is with them, and after a few minutes the mother leaves the room, and you watch to see, does the kid freak out anxiously because mom has left, is the kid excited about playing with the toys and exploratory, all of that. You look at the response to novelty like that in a 5-year-old, and that's already significantly predictive of whether they're going to be voting as a conservative or a progressive 25 years later. Do they have a temperament where new things are anxiety provoking? Okay, but I love that study just because it's
Yeah.
so in your face. Like by age 5, your wiring of that is already a factor in there. Okay, but the larger issue you raise, Yeah, if you really follow through on all of these implications, it's like an unrecognizably different world, and it's revolutionary. And it's a revolution that's going to have to play out with baby steps over the next umpteen centuries or something, because, yeah, this is incredibly difficult. I'm a creature of my time and place, which means that I very easily jump into judgments of people, or I very easily jump into moments where I'm pleased with myself or feel entitled to something. And then even I have to stop myself. And like once every 3 months, I could function for 2 minutes, really absent any of this stuff. It's going to be really, really hard. So maybe what we need to do is just, be satisfied with the baby steps and push, because
Right.
like in your lifetime and mine, we've seen a world of difference in people thinking about how people wind up with their sexual orientation or their sexual identity. When I was a kid, I would have been contemptuous of the kid sitting next to me who wasn't learning how to read because they were lazy, they were stupid. And now, like, thank God, decades later, I've been able to incorporate that. That's a world where volition has nothing to do with it. Subtract that out. And when you do that, not only is it like a much better world, because now you learn how to teach kids with dyslexia, and you use different approaches, so it's more effective. You've learned about the buttons and the levers. But even more importantly, you're not raising kids to think that they are stupid and unmotivated because their cortical microarchitecture is screwy or whatever. So I don't know, maybe we have to content ourselves with doing just a few steps at a time. And anytime somebody does something that's evoking a judgment in us, especially when it's a harsh one, we should stop and think a second time and a 40th time and go on the assumption that, like, you have earned no better treatment than anybody else.
Right. Let me talk about a bit about the criminal justice system, because what you argue for there is essentially a revolutionary revamping of the criminal justice system. You argue for what I think you call the quarantine system. In other words, given that all you said about the lack of free will and the lack of control people have over their actions, the idea that we should engage in punishment of criminals is not something that's really justified. You recognize, obviously, there are people who may be dangerous, a threat to others, and what we should do there is essentially remove them from society for a period of time until we think they cease being dangerous. Is that a fair assessment of your view?
Yeah. And if they never cease being dangerous, they have to be constrained forever after.
Right.
But
Right.
with a critical sort of caveat in there, constrain the person so that they're no longer a danger, but not 1 inch further. Not anything other than just the instrumental task of keeping society safe from them, and not anything marinated in retribution, the notion that justice is being served, anything like that, not 1 inch further. And don't preach to them about their horrible souls in the process. And put lots of research into root causes of how did we wind up with people who cause damage like that. This is public health epidemiology. You quarantine
Right.
the person who's infectious, you do the absolute minimum, but then they can go about the rest of their lives of whatever. You don't tell them they're consorting with Satan because they've got a virus or whatever, and you make sure people do research on viral stuff. And like you do the same thing with people who are damaging, or let's state it, people who, because they have been damaged in a way out of their control, wound up being damaging. And this is how you protect society. Oh my God, how are we supposed to actually do that? We do that all the time. Suppose you got like, okay, your kid is sneezing. What do? You do preemptive pre-crime quarantine. You keep them home from preschool tomorrow, because the rule is if your kid's sneezing, please keep them home so they don't get everybody else sick. You quarantine, you constrain them. Do you tell them they've got a rotten soul and that's why do you tell them they can't play with their toys? You do the minimum to constrain them. And other than that, you do nothing else. And then you hope somebody figures out how, like, nose colds work. And we do the same thing when we say a pilot who has hay fever in the spring and is taking antihistamines and is drowsy can't fly the plane for a certain number of days. Not because they're rotten, but they can do anything else, but let's protect society from that, and let's hope somebody figures out an antihistamine that doesn't make you drowsy. Or these days, you get somebody who out of nowhere has a grand mal seizure, no prior history, while they're driving and lose control of the car. We don't punish them. We don't tell them they're sleeping with Beelzebub or something. But what we do is say, depending on the state, you now have to go X number of months being seizure free on your meds before you can get your driver's license back. And it
Yeah,
works. It
it
works. It's
works,
a
but
better
I do
world.
think, is it a better world? I guess that's a question I have. I think what people, when they, have a chance to process this conversation, will think about, are you really portraying a better world? Maybe it's a world we have to accept from science, but is it really going to be a better world? Seems to have some counterintuitive results. Let me give you, obviously, you knew I was going to bring up Hitler. Obviously, people always bring up Hitler. So based on what I read, because philosophers have to, invent him if he didn't exist. Here's a guy who did some things that, most people regard as, the epitome of evil, horrible things. He ordered the murder of millions of people. But if you think about, I mean, based on what I've read, in terms of like his ordinary dealings with day to day with people, seemed to be just kind of an ordinary guy, at least before the end of the war, where he started to rant and rave. He seemed to be kind to at least Aryan people. He loved Aryan children, supposedly, was a vegetarian, loved animals, all this stuff. Clearly, very dangerous person if he were in control of government, or if he had any say over political things, or maybe even if he had the right to publish his views. But let's say, okay, we arrest Hitler after the end of the war, and what we decide is, okay, you can't have any power anymore. You can't write anything. We don't even want you speak anymore because you're dangerous. Your views are ridiculous. And maybe we say, look, we have to, we're going to send you to like a, years long, uh, camp. So you better understand, racist and, how your theories are racist and ridiculous. But after that, yeah, you're fine. You can walk free because we don't consider you dangerous anymore. Again, with these restrictions. On your view, isn't that a possibility?
Yeah,
Yeah,
unfortunately,
right.
if you really
Yeah,
believe this stuff, if you
yeah,
really believe it, that's where you have to take it. If you
yeah.
really believe this stuff, not only is there no room for blame or whatever if you get somebody who has their first epileptic seizure from out of nowhere and lose control of their car, but you have to reach the same conclusion if it's somebody who knows they have a seizure disorder and didn't want to take their meds that day. And
Yeah.
because they had no control over their lack of control in that domain either. It's all the exact same thing. I mean, for a bunch of personal family reasons, Hitler looms mighty big in my psyche and Nazis. And a few years back, I started working with a public defender defense team defending a white supremacist who went into a synagogue with an automatic weapon and shot people. And like, okay, if I really like believe any of this nonsense, yeah, he's an incredibly dangerous broken machine. It's probably worth, reflecting now and then that he didn't get to that point without a lot of pain and a lot of fear and all that. But the main thing is like, no, he's not evil. Evil is irrelevant. Just make sure he can't do it again. But if he's completely safe and he wants to go to the beach because it's a nice, beautiful, sunny day, um, that's okay
Yeah.
because he really had nothing. And that, if you follow this stuff, has to extend to Hitler.
Sure. Yeah. And again, I think people have to have that sink in and they'll have to decide whether your viewpoint leads to a utopia or a dystopia. It's an interesting question. Again, no question the scientific argument you present is compelling, certainly at a certain level. Though again, I think people may just hesitate at saying, look, you know, we still have to have this sense of moral responsibility. Again, for people who don't have the clearly impairing problems of schizophrenia or other mental illnesses, or they have a gun to their head or whatever. Uh, but obviously, something with food for thought. I'm going to check to see if we've had any questions come in because I don't want to dominate the discussion. Although I could enjoy talking to you, I think, for a couple hours because it's a very rewarding discussion.
Likewise.
Yeah, let me see if we have any questions here. Uh, let's see. So Alan asks, uh, so a violent fascist couple have 4 children and raise them to be violent fascists. Guess that happens. If one that chooses not to be violent or fascist, I guess one of the children, in other words, they deserve no praise because they overcame all that, which I suppose could happen, right?
Yeah, and here we get into the flip side of it. Okay, so we gotta like decide that Hitler had no control over who he turned into. Yeah, if you go for this, you really have to decide that Mother Teresa had nothing to do with the person she turned out to be. Praise and reward make as little sense as blame and punishment. And in my mind, how we keep society safe from dangerous people while still, living with this notion of no free will is so much easier than how we go about like motivating people to do hard, commendable things because we need society to have people who are good at difficult stuff. Yeah, the meritocracy side of it is so much harder. And in some ways, it's so much more deceptive because, oh, the one kid who managed not to, they wound up in the right classroom with the right charismatic teacher who influenced them. They wound up being in a peer group where they wound up with one friend who had they had no control
Yeah.
over that either, or they've got more dopamine D4 receptors in this part of the brain than their other siblings do, or anything like that. Yeah, all of these are not coming from nowhere. And
Yeah.
it's sure nicer, amid my ways in which I'm a total hypocrite with this, one of the ways in which I'm like most egregiously so is, I'm a professor, I hand out grades, and if I really believe this stuff, grading makes no sense at all other than being just a filter for competence and all of that. But more so, I've got this completely terrible bias that shows I really don't believe this stuff most of the time. And that it's great when I've got like some kid in my seminar who's just smart and you could see they get it 2 seconds into what they get it and they're on the implications, all of that. But the ones I really like are the ones who maybe didn't come from as privileged of a background, and you see they are working their asses off in there, and you can see their progress over the course of it, and I love those kids, and I look for every opportunity to bump their grades up, and that's nonsense. That's falling for like,
Right.
oh, the kid who managed not to become a fascist like all their siblings and parents. That's just as biological also, and that's one where like I have to fight my own biases. Yeah, it's hard. Nobody's saying this is easy. I've been thinking this way since I was 14, and I can actually live with these principles about a half of 1% of the time. Yeah, but we got to try.
Okay. Let me see if there's some other questions here. Here's one which we've kind of danced around a bit, but maybe we can expand on a bit. From Lori, what would society be like if all members understood that free will didn't exist? And let me add to that by saying that, in your book, I think you do a good job of knocking down the argument that, well, if people didn't believe in free will, we all would run amok, right? Then we go around and, doing whatever we want, and hurting people, whatever. I don't think that would be the case. Among other things, running amok requires energy. I think more likely that if we just start kind of thinking, oh, everything's outside of control, we may become listless and think, yeah, what's the point? Why am I striving? Because if I'm striving, people are going to say, it's because you had these privileges and you had piano lessons when you were a kid and you had parents who were ambitious for you and you don't deserve any encouragement or praise. And what would society be like
Well,
if everyone came around to thinking that we had no free will?
Well, what would happen is, among other things, separate of no prisons and no corner offices and bloated CEO salaries that also come with a sense of social Darwinist self-worth, or yeah, get all that stuff out of the way. But what it will be is a world in which you do something like capable or something kind or something entertaining aesthetically or something. And instead of people having grown up to think that they say, wow, thanks for it's so great that you did that. It's so great. To instead say, I'm so grateful that you turned out to be the sort of person who could help me in the way you did just now. And if you hear that from like kindergarten on up, um, you don't come away from that thinking, ooh, I'm great because I turned out to be like me. I guess I'm grateful too that I turned out to be that sort of person. And if in the face of every person who is acting in a way that is negative, off-putting, different, and what you've also been trained to do is think, how did they become that way? And what has their life been that I have no idea about and could never imagine? And how did that, and I think, maybe we wouldn't have people pushing quite as hard to get into sort of the most prestigious nursing homes out there and buffing up their resume from age 20 to do that. A lot of the striving would be shown to be for pretty bad reasons. And that takes us back to that challenge of, nonetheless, how do you get people to work really, really hard at mastering something difficult? But an overall picture is we are who we are, and
Would
we don't
there
deserve.
be a temptation for society to try to have more control over how kids are raised? Not only that, how people get together to have children. If in fact there are all these influences, obviously we can't change everything in the past. Whether we're inherited all our history and what have you and our evolution, but we can certainly perhaps say, well, this couple isn't fit because they're incompatible. They're not going to be raising children properly. Not going to give attention to them. Uh, the state has to come in and take control of the education to make sure everyone has a very similar education. Uh, would it lead to that type of change to have more state control over marriage and how children are raised?
Nah, but you're on the exact same sort of territory as doing any of these, of who gets to decide what's normal and abnormal, who gets to decide what's right and wrong. We got endless history showing all the ways in which that can go off the rails in some really malignant kind of ways and such. Yeah, whatever version you have of holding people responsible for their actions or constraining people yet not blaming them for any one of those, somebody's going to be deciding what's right and wrong. And yeah, we know that's going to get you on thin ice, but I think no more so than any other system that we're contemplating.
Okay. Let me check some other questions there. I think I know the answer to this, but I think it's worth mentioning because I know Daniel Dennett is someone that is held, the late Daniel Dennett, held in esteem by many associated with the Center for Inquiry. He was a friend of the center. So Usman asks, what do you think of the late Dan Dennett's viewpoint of having free will?
I so admire him and am grateful for the spearheading role he played in atheism and humanism and all of that, and great and brave and all of that. I deeply disagree with his stance on free will, and I guess this counts as one of those lucky privileges in life. I got to debate him about 5 months ago, and I think it was kind of a messy bloodbath about our very different opinions. It was some Oxford thing. Um, he has a view, he had a view of putting a whole lot of credence into intuition, into it feels like we just made a choice. It feels like we just had agency. And very often, when you look closely at his writing, when he was being his most sort of revealing, he was saying, like, I don't know if there's free will or not, but we better believe in it because it's going to be so demoralizing if there isn't. When you really look closely, he was leading with his emotions much of the time. Like he had this one interview where he was going through, oh my God, I would not want to live in a society where people thought there was no free will. There'd be murderers and rapists all running around all over the place. That motif, and that wouldn't be the case. And he said, and what about your accomplishments? What about feeling like you earned the prizes that you've gotten? And saying, oh, yeah, okay, so that's the big worry, that life is going to set you up so that you won't feel proud of all the prizes that you get. For most people out there, they're being treated way worse than average because of stuff that they had no control over, not because they were being given prizes. So I deeply disagreed with him, but I'm sure glad I got to debate him, and I'm sure glad he was the strident voice he was for humanism and atheism.
Let's go on that one point you mentioned, especially just the thing about motivation. Wouldn't it be true that if people came to your viewpoint of free will, a lot of the motivation that people have for action? I mean, isn't it true that many people at least, want to strive? They want to strive to be the best. And that, you know, don't we benefit from that? That, people set out, look, I want to be the one that develops AI, or I want to be the one who spends time researching how to come up with a cure for cancer or develop this vaccine or what have you. And yeah, I want some recognition for that because, damn well, I'm spending 10 years in the laboratory trying to come up with the answers about, how we can have this vaccine that'll help us from this pandemic. And yeah, it'd be nice if people said, hey, you did a good job and praise. And yeah, maybe he's a monetary award or some kind of recognition for that. Are we taking away all those incentives that people have? And don't we as a society benefit from having that system of incentives?
Yeah, that's, dealing with dangerous people, that's so much easier than exactly what you're bringing up. I don't know the answer to that one because expecting somebody to sit there and say, wow, I am so grateful. I just worked for 23 years to come up with this vaccine. I'm so grateful that I turned out to be someone who could do that. That's a big ask. It's a big
Mm.
ask, like to take a pianist and have them get to a mindset where saying, whoa, how did it happen that I wound up fingers that could do this and bring audiences to tears? Damn, I'm so grateful that I turned out to be somebody with like fingers that could do. Yeah, that's really, really hard. And maybe just the baby steps in that direction because, like, who knows how to, I mean, people need to work hard to be good at taking out your brain tumor, things of that
Right.
sort. And you really want them to have put in the hard work instead of partying. Maybe is just taking down the notion that things like that are the basis of your moral worth, that anything like that should earn you like being able to cut into the front of the line when important things are being handed out, that all you are is the outcome of like you lucked out. You had
Mhm.
parents who you had a mother who wasn't an alcoholic and you didn't get born with fetal alcohol syndrome, and that's why you're a cardiothoracic surgeon. And don't give people salaries and senses of entitlements that suggest that there's moral worth to their expertise that far outstrips the expertise itself. That's nice, sensible things, but it's really a big ask to get somebody who, for example, has gone like years getting no sleep as a surgical resident to come out the other end and not feel like they deserve something, to instead just feel, whoa, I'm so grateful I turned out to be the sort of person who over and over can go 36 hours without sleeping and still function. Yeah, those are hard asks. And there's going to be the subset of people when it comes to this motivating thing. where like you don't need to motivate them. These are like the people who would like pay you to get the chance to go back to thinking about nothing but like gecko physiology or whatever it is they're maddened about. And like, yeah, there's some sort of like good twin of sociopaths, or they're completely immune to reinforcement. But for most people, yeah, it takes something to drive you to spend 50 years trying to solve Fermat's last theorem, or like try to get clean water for people throughout West Africa, or any of those things. I guess the baby step version of it now is that the person at least doesn't come out the other end feeling like they are thus intrinsically a better human than other people and more entitled to have their needs considered, because they had no control over that either.
Right. Let me end with another tough question we may have to face, and that is, we've talked about people don't really have moral responsibility in any ultimate sense, not really moral agents, presumably. If you don't have moral agents and moral responsibility, do you have morality at all? Can we speak about things being morally better or morally worse?
No, it's
Nothing.
completely nonsense. It's just this construct that we got when our social systems got complicated enough, I don't know, 20,000 years ago, that individual behaviors that counted as norm violations got ornate enough that we could begin to see patterns and we could formalize it into moral systems. But yeah, oh, you're not being
Well, that goes away
immoral.
too. Yeah, that
Yeah,
goes away. So I guess we can speak about things being more pleasant or unpleasant in some way, or maybe generating more material well-being for us and less material well-being, but not
or
things being morally better or morally worse.
yeah, or having to agree on some first principles. Like, it's silly to say that something good could happen to a biological machine, but nonetheless, it's a good thing when biological machines feel less pain and feel less fear and have like enough food and shelter and all that. And like just on that level. And if you're about to say, oh my God, that's so dehumanizing, that's a hell of a lot better than demonizing people into being sinners because of stuff they had nothing to do with.
Well, we'll have to let that be the last word since we're out of time here. I wish we had more time to continue this discussion, but we have to stick to our time limit. And this has been a very rewarding, I think, very enjoyable conversation on my end. I found it very thought stimulating, as I did your book. So thank you for that. Again, I don't want to praise you too much for that, but whether you deserve praise or not, it was an accomplishment, and it's certainly a contribution to the conversations we should have in our society. So thank you for
Well,
that. Thank you for the
thank you.
conversation.
This was a pleasure. And maybe just to put that last comment of yours in perspective, I lucked out. My parents traumatized me in the exact perfect way to produce someone who would write that book 60 years later or whatever. So, yeah, it worked out. Cool.
Okay.
But
Well,
yes,
great.
this was great fun.
Okay. Good. Thank you and good night. And this will be the end of our program on Skeptical Inquirer Presents. Good evening and thank you, Dr. Sapolsky.
Take care.